All right, so we're going to look at a few different topics today. We're going to start with guides, look at how we duplicate something by copying and pasting. We're going to mirror stuff by flipping it with a transformation. And then we're going to join paths together to create a single object from multiple different paths. So what are guides? Guides are just a method of allowing you to create symmetry and keep things sort of in line with each other. So for my project here, I'm just going to draw a line, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key to make it vertical. And all I want to do is I want to sort of say, it's like, well, I'm going to make my pen tool draw some lines through certain areas, and I want to make sure that they're the same. So, maybe I know I need it to go out here and in there and way out there. And I need my external pieces to be in line with these lines, and maybe something like that. Doesn't matter. All that really matters is that I have one line that's going to act as my center point. Because if we're going to mirror something, we need an axis of symmetry, something that's going to flip over to create two identical objects. Now, the problem with this is that while I've drawn these and they would work perfectly well as a visual reference, if I accidentally click on one, I move it. So we don't want that to happen. So I'm going to undo that with Control-Z. And I want to actually lock these in place. And the easy way to do that is I'm going to go ahead and select them all using a bounding box by just dragging around and selecting. And I'm going to go up here to View, and I'm going to come all the way down to Guides. And the third option is Make Guides. It actually creates the guides out of whatever it is that you've got selected. So I press Make Guides or Control-5 on my keyboard. And you notice they immediately turn from the color I had drawn them into this cyan, really thin lines. And if I put my mouse over them, it says Guide. And you'll notice that now I can't select them. I cannot click and drag them away. They are simply there on my screen. They're visual references or guide marks for what I'm going to work. So I'm going to come over here and grab my pen tool, which is right here on the left. And I'm going to start any place I want. I'm just going to start right here. I'm going to say, it's like, well, I want it to be horizontal. So I'll hold down Shift, give me a horizontal line. And it's going to have to come through this point. And it's got to come up through this end point here. And once again, I'm not really worried about the actual shape I'm building. The idea is that you would probably know what shape you're trying to build for yourself. But the idea is that this allows you to build a shape through certain points and create that form. And maybe it's supposed to come back here. Okay? And maybe I want it to be horizontal, so I'll drop it off there. And this leaves me with a shape. I can hit Escape, and I get a half shape right here. And it's just visible. I can drag it around if I want to. But the important part is that my top point here and my bottom point here are, in fact, vertically aligned. They're in the same column. And that's going to be really important when we try to duplicate. So what does it mean to duplicate? It means that you take something and you mirror it around an axis. Now, in our case, we have a vertical axis here, and I want to duplicate it. So I have to create a copy. Now, to do that, we can do it a few different ways. If I can select it by just clicking on it, I can come up here to Object, and I can come over here to Edit, and I can go, hey, I need to copy it. And then I can go Edit and paste it as well. But you notice that just drops it in the middle of my artboard, which isn't where I want it. I need a perfect mirror of this shape. So in order to do that, we've got to go do it a little differently. I'm going to select this and hit Delete. And I'm going to reselect my initial shape. I'm going to come over here and go again to Edit and go to Copy. And then I'm going to go to Edit. And what I want to do is copy it. And now I want to paste it in front. The difference between paste and paste in front is that paste drops it just in the center of your visible screen. Paste in front takes an object and creates a copy of it perfectly on top of that object in a new layer. In fact, if you look over here, right now we have one path with our curvy shape. And when I paste in front, even though nothing seems to change on this screen, we now have two of our selection items here, two of our curvy bits. So now we have to find a way to mirror one and flip it. And there are a couple of things we're going to have to do about that. When I click here and try and drag a box around it, you'll notice that I select both of them, which isn't what I want to do. I only want to mess with a single one of my objects. So I can select it in a couple of different ways. I can come over and just click and release. That gets me a single object. Or if I come over to my layers panel, I can come down here to this section right here, and I can click there and it will select a single one instead of both. And that's what I really care about. So next up, we have to go ahead and we have to copy this and mirror it. So to do that, we're going to go to the Transformations panel. And the Transform panel can be accessed by clicking on the X, the Y, the W, or the H. They all go to the same place. So I'm going to go ahead and click on X. And immediately, if I'm looking to flip something horizontally, I'll notice that there's no button that just says flip. So I have to go to the submenu, which is this little 3 lines here. And now suddenly I have these options. And very specifically, I have flip horizontally. Now remember, horizontally means left to right. Vertically here means bottom to top. Okay? So I want to flip this horizontally, and I'll go ahead and flip it. And right off the bat, you notice it did flip, but the problem is it didn't flip it over this edge. It flipped it over the center of the object. So that's no good. I'm going to press Control-Z and go back. And I'm going to go back to my Transform panel, and I can make it flip horizontally, but I need it to flip over the side instead of the center. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to look at this little object. So this object is called the reference point. In fact, if I put my mouse over it, that's what it calls it. You'll notice it's in the center, and it's surrounded by these 8 dots. And these 8 dots correspond to the corners of a selected object. You'll notice that there's 3 across the top, and we have 1, 2, 3 across the top. There's 2 in the middle, 1 and 2. And there's also 1 in the center that you just can't see. And then 3 at the bottom, 1, 2, 3. Now, this reference point is just the area where Illustrator thinks of when you try to do transformations. Now, in this case, since I want it to flip over this side, I need to flip it over one of these edges. So I'm going to pick the center right edge as my reference point. And now I'm going to come over here and go flip horizontally. And suddenly, there it is. I've got my shape flipped perfectly horizontally. It's perfectly aligned for me to work with. Now, the next problem I have is that if I select this and say I want to fill it, if I go to fill it, it only fills an individual piece. Okay? It's only going to fill those single halves. But I don't want that. I want them to be a single combined shape. If I come over here and look at my layers panel, again, I have 2 shapes. I want to connect them. So we have to select our 2 objects and join them together. Now, to select them, we can do a couple of things. We could drag a giant box there. That will select them both. And you notice over in the layers panel, it does select them both. The problem is if I have anything else that I'm working on in here, it would select those as well, and that's no good. We just need to select just these 2. So there are a couple of ways to do that. The first would be to draw a box around just a very small portion of it. If I select it where I'm just touching both of them just a little bit, it will select them both, and it wouldn't select anything that's in there. The better way to do it is to use Shift Select. So if I click on this one, I get it selected over here. Then I hold down the Shift key on my keyboard, holding it down, and click on the other object I want to select. Click over here, and suddenly I've gotten these 2. And that way, nothing else is ever going to be selected by holding down Shift when you click on individual items. So now that I've got them both selected, I need to tell Illustrator to connect the endpoints. Now, this is going to work really well because my endpoints are overlapping. They're right on this same line, which is why it's really important to do it this way. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to go to Object, and I'm going to go all the way down to Path, and the first option is Join. So Join takes 2 anchor points and welds them together. Now, if those anchor points are on top of each other, it just creates a single anchor point. If they're separated, it will draw a line in between the 2 anchor points. In this case, when I hit Join, you'll notice it immediately changes color, showing me that it is completely solid. And over here in my Layers panel, I now have just one path to work with. So that is the basics of creating guides, mirroring and duplicating an object, and joining those paths together. The last thing we want to look at is we want to look at transformations. So transformations have to do with adjusting the size or scale of a single object. And to do that, we can do a few different things. For my purposes, I want to reference the center of my object, so I'm going to change my reference point back, and then I'm going to open the Transform panel. Now you'll notice we have a few different objects. We have X and Y, W and H, angle for rotate, and shear degrees. So let's talk about each of these. X and Y have to do with the location on the artboard. Okay? This is just like math class. It's a coordinate. If I change this from 5.25 X value, which is our left and right, and change it to 8, it moves it. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Same thing if I go from 4.4 to 8, it's going to move it down because 0 is right up here in the upper left. So it moves it over 8, down 8, and the reference point is the center. So that's our X and Y. That lets us move something around the screen. Our W and our H are our width and our height. We can, in fact, move stuff, or excuse me, change the size of things individually. Now, these have a secondary icon, this little chain that you can either break or leave connected. If I leave it connected and change the size of the width from our 9.6 and of width and 7.5 of height, if I change this to say 12, the very first thing I want you to notice is that my height changed as well. Okay, it went from 7 to almost 9. If I go from 12 down to say 5 and look at it again, I'm now down to 4. The chain constrains the proportions. It basically means that if you change the width by a certain percentage, it will automatically change the height. Now you don't have to do that. You can break that constraint. And now if I change my width from 5 to 10, you notice it distorts the image. It changed my width, but not my height. So in this case, I'm just going to boost this one back up to say about an 8, give me a rough shape back. So that is our width and height, our size transformations. Next up, we have rotations. Now there are two ways to do rotations. Number one, you can in fact just type a number. So if I want this to rotate by 45 degrees, it will rotate it by 45 degrees. If I want it to go back to 0 or 300, I can select it out of those objects. It doesn't matter. The other way you can do rotation is using your mouse. If I click on this object so it's selected, and I move my mouse really close to the corner, you'll notice my cursor changes from an arrow to the curve with arrows on the endpoints. If I now left click and hold and then move my mouse, it allows me to rotate the object to any direction that I want it to go. And I can do that multiple times, however much I like. The last transformation is this shear degree. And the easiest way to figure out what that does is to actually just use it. So we're going to go from a shear of 0 degrees to a shear of 30. And you'll notice it sort of stretched the top over and the bottom to the left. This is essentially leaning an object. The bottom edge stays where it is. The top edge shifts over to one side. Now, it can be positive or negative. So if I go shear at negative 30, it leans to the left instead of to the right. But these are all just different ways of manipulating an object and transforming it into a different shape. And these become really important as we work farther on. Okay? The last piece I want to talk to you about is this last little one, scale, strokes, and effects. Right now, it is set up to do that. I'm going to make it more obvious. So I've got this giant thick border, and I've got scale, strokes, and effects turned on. I'm going to scale this down to, say, 3 inches wide. And you'll notice that the width of my stroke has decreased as well. Okay? It actually made itself smaller. In fact, I'm going to move that to one side, and I'm going to do the same thing again, just so you can see that after duplicating my object. So you'll be able to see both parts. So if I shrink this one down to 3 inches, it shrank the border. This one, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to uncheck scale, strokes, and effects. So now that's not happening anymore. And now I'm going to do the same thing and shrink it down to 3 inches as well. Now in this case, it should be pretty obvious what's happened. On this one, it scaled the stroke down. On this one, it did not. So our stroke is still 1 inch wide, and it looks kind of weird because it didn't reduce that along with the size of it. But those are the basics of transformations that you can use in Illustrator to manipulate, mirror, and duplicate an object.